Hola a todos y bienvenidos. Escúchame bien, vas a querer toda esta información, así que quédate hasta el fin. Me llamo Austin, and today's video continues our series on Spanish verb conjugation. Today we're going to introduce the third and final mood in Spanish, the imperative, and learn to give commands. In the second half of the lesson, I'll introduce object pronouns and how they're used when conjugating. The videos in my conjugation series are meant to be watched in order because as we progress further through the tenses, they start to pull elements from the other tenses I covered earlier in the series. This is going to be kind of a long one today, but I'm going to break down everything you need to know. So let's get to it. When we give commands, we can either tell somebody to do something, an affirmative command, or not to do something, a negative command. Depending on whether we're giving a command in the affirmative or the negative, we're going to have different conjugation rules. One thing to keep in mind, although it might be somewhat obvious, is that we can't give commands to ourselves or to people who aren't listening to us. For that reason, there are no command forms for yo, él, ella, ellos, or ellas. Instead, we only give commands to tú, vos, usted, nosotros, nosotras, vosotros, vosotras, and ustedes. Something that's going to help us tremendously is that most commands in the affirmative or negative are conjugated exactly like the present subjunctive. So if you already know those conjugation rules, this should be much easier for you. If you haven't seen my video on the present subjunctive yet, you can check it out here for an in-depth explanation on how to conjugate. So let's start with our affirmative commands. In the affirmative, only tú, vos, and vosotros, vosotras are not conjugated the same as the present subjunctive. So let's start with those. With nearly all verbs, both regular and irregular, tú is going to be conjugated the same way as the indicative present third person singular for él, ella, and usted. If you're this far in the series, I'm sure you already know how to conjugate that form, but I'll throw those conjugations up now for you to review. Now there are only 8 verbs which don't follow this pattern for tú, and you're about to learn all of them. Keep in mind that any derivative verbs that are built using these irregular verbs will follow the same conjugation patterns. Our 8 irregular verbs are ser, to se, decir, to di, tener, to ten, venir, to ven, ir, to be, hacer, to haz, poner, to pon, and salir, to sal. All right, that's everything for tú. So let's move on. For vos, you'll drop the R at the end of the infinitive and add an accent to the A, E, or I at the end. For example, hablar becomes habla, comer becomes come, and escribir becomes escribí. Now, if you remember how to conjugate for vos in the simple present tense, you might have noticed that the affirmative command form is pretty much identical to that form, except without the S at the end. All right, lastly, for vosotros and vosotras, we just replace the R at the end with a D. Hablar to hablar, comer to comer, and escribir to escribir. That's it. The rest of the affirmative commands and all of the negative commands match the present subjunctive form. Now, I'll throw up the conjugation tables for regular verbs in both command forms now, and you can pause here to review. There are a number of patterns we should be familiar with to handle our irregular verbs, but I covered those patterns in the video on the present subjunctive. Okay, so for the next phase of our lesson to make any sense, I need to teach you something else first, and that's object pronouns. This will be a bit of a long detour, but I promise I'll get back to our commands ASAP. When we conjugate verbs in Spanish, there are 3 forms of object pronouns that we can use to contextualize who or what the verb affects. These pronouns always follow an order hierarchy when more than one is used at a time. And that hierarchy is reflexive, indirect, and then direct. These pronouns are always placed in order either before a conjugated verb or attached to the end of a verb in its infinitive form, present participle, which I'll cover soon in the series, or affirmative commands. Now, reflexive verbs are a type of verb where the subject of the sentence is performing the action on or for themselves. Reflexive verbs in their infinitive form will have a se at the end, and that verb takes on a different meaning from the version of the verb without the se. Most of the time, a reflexive verb is a variation of another verb which has a similar meaning. One example of a reflexive verb in a sentence is when we ask someone their name. The verb llamar, to call, when used reflexively becomes llamarse, to call oneself. So when we ask someone, ¿Cómo te llamas?, we're literally asking them, how do you call yourself? Now, the reflexive pronouns are me for yo, te for tú and vos, nos for nosotros, nosotras, os for vosotros, vosotras, and we leave it as se for él, ella, ellos, ellas, usted, and ustedes. Okay, so our reflexive pronouns are used when the subject performs an action on or for themselves. So what about when the action is done to or for someone else? Then we'll use an indirect pronoun. The indirect pronouns are me for yo, te for tú and vos, le, sometimes se, for él, ella, and usted, nos for nosotros, nosotras, os for vosotros, vosotras, and les, sometimes se, for ellos, ellas, and ustedes. So, as an example, if we want to say, I told him, that translates to le dije. Finally, if the action is done on a person or object, oftentimes we'll generalize that object to it in English. We'll use a direct object pronoun. The direct object pronouns are me for yo, te for tú and vos, lo for él, usted, or masculine item, la for ella, usted, or a feminine item, nos for nosotros, nosotras, os for vosotros, vosotras, los for ellos, ustedes, or masculine items, and las for ellas, ustedes, or feminine items. For example, if we want to say, the police arrested her, that translates to la policía la detuvo. These pronouns can be combined together to give a more complete picture of who or what is affected by an action. Remember, we always follow the order reflexive, then indirect, then direct. Now, one little quirk of Spanish that came about to make pronunciation easier is that when the indirect object le or les are used before the direct object starting with el, lo, la, los, or las, then le and les turn into se. For example, if we want to translate, are you going to give it to him? That will translate to either se lo vas a dar or vas a dárselo. So what's the difference between those two sentences? Your preference. That's it. Son iguales. Now, there's more nuance to objects and pronouns in Spanish, and I'll be sure to cover that more in depth sometime, but that should be enough for now to get you going using objects and their pronouns in your speech. So now that we have that knowledge in our toolkit, let's get back to our main topic and talk about how to use pronouns with commands. Like I mentioned, object pronouns are usually used before the conjugated verb, with the exception of affirmative commands, when they're attached after. For example, if we want to tell someone, give it to me, that translates as dámelo. With our negative commands, the object pronouns always go between the negating word and the verb. So if we want to say, don't give it to me, that translates as no me lo des. Okay, now let's talk about pronunciation and accent marks. All words in Spanish have only one syllable that's stressed. Whenever a word has an accent mark, always stress it there. When a word has no accent mark, stress the second to last syllable for all words ending with a vowel, N, or S. For all other words, stress the last syllable. Stressing the wrong syllable in the word oftentimes changes the meaning of the word and will confuse the person we're talking to. When we add pronouns to the end of our affirmative commands, we have to make sure that we always stress the same syllable that would have been stressed without those pronouns added. For example, the verb hacer, to do or make, in its affirmative tú command form is haz, with the stress naturally falling on that one syllable. If we want to say make it, with it referring to a feminine object, we'll say hazla, and the stress still naturally falls on the same syllable using standard pronunciation rules. But if we want to say make it for me, that becomes hazmela, and we have to place an accent over that first syllable to preserve the pronunciation, because without it, the word would be pronounced as hazmela. Okay, now before our practice round, let's talk about some irregularities with affirmative commands which apply only to nosotros and vosotros. When we add the reflexive pronouns nos or os, we drop the last letter from the command before adding our reflexive pronoun. For example, calmarse, to calm down, as a nosotros command is calmémonos. And in Spain, to say calm down to vosotros, we say calmaos. Also, applying only to nosotros this time, when we add both an indirect and direct object to the command, we also drop that last letter. So, let's buy it for him becomes comprémoselo. One last thing, our super irregular verb, ir, is handled differently for nosotros and vosotros. Ir uses the indicative present form instead of the subjunctive form for nosotros. So let's go is vamos instead of vayamos. We can also use vamos a plus our verb in its infinitive for nosotros instead of conjugating the verb. So let's eat will be either comamos or vamos a comer. With vosotros, irse will not drop the D when adding the reflexive pronoun os. So the command leave is idos. All right, that's everything you need to know to get started using commands either with or without object pronouns. So let's just take a breath for a moment. If you're still with me so far, I just want to thank you so much for investing your time with me today. Eres asombroso. I can tell you're taking your learning seriously, and I commend you. I'm working on developing opportunities for the serious learners in my audience to pay a reasonable fee for private one-on-one or group lessons with me to help you learn anything and everything you need to build your fluency. If you're interested in learning directly from me, drop a comment down below and I'll let you know how and when we can make that happen. I'm also thinking about making my entire conjugation spreadsheet available to download for a small fee. So let me know if you're interested in that as well with a comment down below. All right, so now let's do some practice to lock in everything we just learned. Like usual, I'm going to give you some sentences in English and translate them into Spanish with our target verbs unconjugated. And it'll be up to you to come up with the correct conjugation. I'll provide the indirect and direct object pronouns, but if they go with an affirmative command, you'll have to make sure to attach them to the verb and put the accent mark in the right spot for proper pronunciation. For reflexive verbs, you'll need to pick the correct reflexive pronoun. Now, this is an open book test, so if you need to pause and go back to review before deciding on your answer, hazlo. Ponte las pilas. Vamos. Our first example is, don't make a mountain out of a molehill, which isn't actually a direct translation, but rather an expression, which is, tú no ahogarse en un vaso de agua. Literally, this translates to, don't drown in a glass of water. I just love that expression. I think it's so fun to say. So, how are we going to conjugate it here? Are you ready? No te ahogues en un vaso de agua. Okay, our next example is, Don't tell me that you have to work until late tonight. Come home now. Dinner's ready. Our unconjugated translation is no me decir que tienes que trabajar hasta tarde esta noche. Venir a casa ya. La cena está lista. Hint, hint. Don't forget our irregular commands here. All right, you ready? No me digas que tienes que trabajar hasta tarde esta noche. Ven a casa ya. La cena está lista. All right, one last one before we wrap up. I want to know what you did yesterday. Tell me. Seriously? Leave my house. Our translation is, quiero saber qué hiciste ayer. Decírmelo. En serio, irse de mi casa. Make sure you remember our regular verbs and where to stress the syllables. Are you ready for our final answer? Quiero saber qué hiciste ayer. Dímelo. ¿En serio? Vete de mi casa. All right, so how'd you do? If you missed any, don't worry. The important thing is that you tried. And as long as you keep that up, you'll end up right where you want to be. If you got all of the answers right, tu español es muy bueno. All right, well, that's all I have for you today. If you liked today's video, please give that like button a friendly little nudge to let the YouTube gods know that my video is worth sharing to new viewers. My next video will cover all of the perfect tenses, which are just variations of the verb haber conjugated into different tenses to modify our target verb in order to say what has, had, will have, or would have happened. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss that. Lastly, I encourage all of you to practice making your own sentences using what you learned here today. And if you leave a comment down below, I'll make sure to reply to let you know how you did. Estoy tan agradecido de haberte tenido aquí hoy. Nos vemos en el próximo video. Chao.